Welcome to the Compassion Podcast, brought to you by the Global Compassion Coalition. Today's episode is on how we banned the bomb with Daniel Hogsta and Claire Yorke. On July 7, 2017, following a decade of advocacy by the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, also known as ICAN, and its partners, an overwhelming majority of the world's nations adopted a landmark global agreement to ban nuclear weapons. It entered into force on January 22, 2021. In this talk with Claire Yorke, expert on empathy and international security and convener of the GCC's Working Group on International Relations, and Daniel Hogsta, Interim Director of ICAN, they will talk about how the treaty was won, the lessons that were learned, and why peace is always possible.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much to the Global Compassion Coalition for inviting me to chair this discussion. I'm really looking forward to speaking with Daniel. And I wanted to start really with a question for those people who maybe aren't familiar with your work. Can you explain what this treaty is? What was so significant about the achievement in 2017?
Sure, yeah. So the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which, as you say, was negotiated in 2017, was kind of the culmination of about maybe a decade's work in terms of framing the issue and garnering the kind of the political and the diplomatic support for it. But really, it was kind of inspired by previous campaigns which had banned weapons that were deemed to be unacceptable because of their indiscriminate and inhumane effects. Speaking of the treaties that prohibited landmines and cluster munitions, which were banned in the 90s and the early 2000s, as well as a campaign that created a new treaty on regulating the arms trade called the Arms Trade Treaty as well. And what those campaigns and what those the efforts that led to those treaties tried to achieve was to reframe the issue, the weapon at hand, in terms of their humanitarian effects. So I think we take it a little bit for granted now, if I can look at the landmines issue, that these are weapons that are considered to be not a weapon that countries are proud to have in their arsenal or talk about. And you see very few companies kind of investing in these weapons. And what the landmines campaign successfully did was to reframe that, because previously those weapons were seen as weapons of last resort and the kind of the most important weapon that a country could have in its arsenal in terms of defensive purposes. So those campaigns successfully reframed those issues into the humanitarian, to focus on the humanitarian impacts of those weapons, which created a new groundswell of support from governments across the world, especially and led by the countries that were kind of most affected by those weapons, and ultimately leading to a treaty which is now considered to be one of the most successful disarmament treaties in the world. So from that experience, we try to kind of look at nuclear weapons in the same way. Nuclear weapons are unfortunately seen as some kind of mythical weapon. We often talk about, in the UK, for example, you very often hear political parties in the government, they never say our nuclear weapons, they talk about our deterrent. This kind of sanitizing language around nuclear weapons, which is, makes it seem like these weapons, just exist in a silo and are never meant to be used. And what we know is that there's, aside from the fact that all weapons are meant to be used, and there's planning ongoing all the time for using these kinds of weapons, but we also know that there's the risk of accidents with these weapons. And when it comes to nuclear weapons, of course, an accident is kind of unimaginable and catastrophic. So by reframing the issue, by moving away from a kind of security-centric and old Cold War era doctrine around these weapons, we were able to generate more progress. I think most importantly, we were able to make governments see that this is not just an issue for the nuclear weapon states, the 9 nuclear weapon states in the world, but this is also an issue for all governments, because if there's a nuclear war anywhere in the world, that would affect all countries as well. So actually, the countries that really led the momentum, built up the momentum for this, and the ones that we worked with most closely were governments from the so-called global South, who saw this as an issue that was of importance for them as well. One of the phrases that kind of came up, which I think is very, very apt, is this idea that with the TPNW, with the treaty, democracy finally came to nuclear disarmament as well. And I think that's a really useful phrase. So At the point where we're at right now, I mean, the treaty was negotiated in 2017. It entered into force in 2021, which means that a certain number of governments, in this treaty's case, 50 governments, joined the treaty, which allowed it to become binding international law on its states parties. So what we're seeing right now is the treaty growing in not only number of states parties, but also growing in relevance in the countries that are still relying on nuclear weapons as well. So broadly speaking, that's where we are with the treaty and why we in ICAN find it to be so important.
Thank you. And I really want to come later on to kind of the challenge now and how you continue to build the work. But I wonder if you could take us back a little bit to the very early days of the campaign. How did you succeed in reframing? What kind of techniques, what skills, what objectives did you have to try and shift the debate in the way that you said, from this quite sterile, sanitized idea of nuclear weapons to a much more humanitarian and moral one?
Yeah, so I think it's important to remember, I mean, obviously the issue of nuclear weapons have been in the public consciousness for a lot, ever since 1945, of course. I mean, many that came out as well. And obviously that was, big news at the time as well. And ever from that first moment, the efforts to start disarmament, started then. The International Committee on the Red Cross very early on said that these weapons must never be used again and probably should be prohibited. The problem was, by the time that ICAN got started, and certainly we in ICAN don't claim all credit for this. I mean, we're building on the work that took place for many years, and many of the people who worked, on previous arms control treaties, as they're called, are part of ICAN as well. But the situation in, let's say, the 2010s was quite particular, because you had, at that time, there was a lot of discussion at the UN around, a lot of name calling at the UN and a lot of complaining about the UN, but you had a basically two-tier system. You had the governments with nuclear weapons who dictated when and how these weapons would be discussed. And then you had the other countries in the world, to varying degrees, basically complaining about the status quo, and using the forums that were built, that were basically stacked in the favor of the nuclear weapon states to basically complain but not be able to do anything. So what we needed to do at that time, and of course there was still a lot of experience and a lot of memory in the diplomatic sphere of the treaties that banned landmines and cluster munitions, was to change the way that the weapon was discussed. And I mean, I know that sounds like it could be quite a big and quite a nebulous, like how do you reframe an issue? I mean, obviously it's something that we're thinking about all the time, but in practical terms, what it meant was get as many governments as possible to use the phrase humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons in any statement about nuclear weapons at the UN, or about nuclear weapons in any kind of multilateral forum as well. That might seem kind of, a minor detail, but it was actually extremely important. It was a big part of our campaign, because the more governments that said it, the more you could demonstrate that there's momentum behind it, and the more you could demonstrate that there was kind of a new awareness around how we should talk about nuclear weapons as well. So a big part of ICAN's lobbying effort was to do precisely that. I mean, not just say this, but also to inform them about what this meant. In concert with those kinds of diplomatic efforts, which took place mainly at the United Nations in Geneva and New York, there were also 3 conferences that were called the Conferences on the Humanitarian Impact of Nuclear Weapons, which took place in Norway first, and then Mexico, and then Austria. This was in 2013 and 2014 as well. Those conferences were hugely important, and we wouldn't have gotten the treaty without them. And we were working very closely with the governments that were hosting those conferences as well. And the purpose was to put on display the kind of all the latest, the latest research and academic material that was out there about the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons. So what would happen if a nuclear weapon, not only if a nuclear war was conducted, but what would happen if a nuclear weapon hit, a city in, this part of the world, and to actually demonstrate that there is no humanitarian response capacity. Not only are we're not prepared for it, but it's probably not even possible to prepare in an adequate way for it. And I think it's a lot of things that perhaps we take for granted, in the public. Like everyone knows, oh, nuclear weapons are bad, but to actually be confronted with, no, this is actually how bad they are. These are the numbers. I think in Europe or in Sweden, where I'm from, there's less than 100 burn beds, in the whole country as well. And if you think about if a nuclear weapon was to hit there, how many people would need burn beds? It would be totally impossible to deal with that. So putting that up there is quite a stark reminder, not only to the diplomats and civil society in the room, but also to kind of media around it, that there's something that's taking place. There's new stuff that's taking place there. And I think the other aspect, which I think is probably the most important aspect, is that it was a major opportunity in an international forum to, give the stage to the people who have actually been affected by nuclear weapons. And of course, the voice of the hibakusha, which is the Japanese word which refers to people who survived the bombings in Hiroshima or experienced the bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki as well. But also, it's not very well known that there's been 2,000 nuclear weapons tests since 1945, around the world, the last being in the 90s. And obviously those tests, they tried to do it in remote places, but in many places people were forcibly removed from their homes, or there was the group in the United States is called the downwinders group, which actually meant that they were living downwind from where the radioactive fallout was happening as well. And that's something that they didn't show in the Oppenheimer movie, for example, that, they presented this open space, and it was more presented like it was sad for Oppenheimer that his ancestral land was used for this. But actually there were people who got cancer as a result of that first detonation as well. Anyway, so those communities were able to be on stage at these kind of conferences as well, which I think was extremely poignant, and I think was also kind of a lesson from the landmines and cluster munitions campaigns, who were really led by impacted persons as well. So I could go on for so long about this, Claire, because I'm quite passionate about it. But just to leave it short, it was these kinds of things. It was a diplomatic process, also reframing the issue in the public, using social media in a kind of a very savvy way to target key politicians. And I think we take for granted today, how social media works and how annoying it can be. But at that time, it was very new for the diplomatic sphere for social media to be used in that way as well. So that's in general terms how it works. And I should also mention, just from ICAN's perspective, that we're not just one office here in Geneva, but we are a network of partner organizations. So there's in over, I think, about 108 countries now, we have over 600 partner organizations. And they were actually the ones that were leading the work nationally to get their governments to understand the treaty and to support it as well.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Thank you so much. And I actually was working in Chatham House when this was going on with Dr. Patricia Lewis, who led a project on humanitarian impact. And I just saw her a couple of weeks ago. Yeah, I remember being really struck by exactly what you said, that we all know the catastrophic nature of nuclear weapons. We've seen images of Hiroshima. We know that they can be absolutely devastating, but we don't think about what comes next in terms of when this happens, how do you get the aid to people? How do you deliver medical supplies? How do you look after, like you say, the burn victims, the people who've maybe survived that? And then also, how do you go about repopulating or re-providing for an area that's been absolutely decimated? And it's those kind of more pragmatic dimensions that actually have a huge amount of traction in political circles, because they start to think about that longer term implication, not just the horrific immediate impact, but the real long-term catastrophic impact.
But just on that, I think it's really important to remember, like, when the nuclear weapons war planning that takes place in nuclear weapon states, they're quite open about the fact that the planning ends when the nuclear weapons are used. They don't plan beyond that.
It's crazy, right? That we know that these weapons have very, very long half-lives, that they have huge kind of implication. That we're not thinking about that is crazy and so makes what you're doing so important that you're bringing this to the fore. And I especially like the focus on giving voice to people who maybe are marginalized or excluded from such discussions. And we're seeing that with climate change right now, because it's often people in indigenous communities, Pacific Island nations, small island nations that are targeted and affected by these that don't often get their voice. Are you finding that that's still an effective way of speaking to kind of the international organizations in the United Nations, that there's movement growing to really reveal the different implications of security?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think you're exactly right. The communities that were affected by the nuclear weapons testing was disproportionately indigenous communities or largely marginalized, people in these kinds of countries as well. And obviously, the Pacific Islands, are big players in the climate sphere, and in terms of their kind of effective activism there. They're also super active on the nuclear weapons issue as well. Kiribati is kind of leading some of the work. I mean, it's obviously a very, very small country, but in the UN sphere, they're playing a huge role in terms of developing how the articles in the treaty on victim assistance and environmental remediation are going to look. Because there's 2 articles in the treaty which are intended to kind of set up a new victim assistance process and a new environmental remediation process, because a lot of these communities are still, not only are people themselves kind of still affected through various diseases or kind of birth defects from the testing, but also the environments are still kind of devastated as well, and no proper cleanup has taken place as well. I mean, there's a famous spot in the Marshall Islands as well, which is called the Rurik Dome, which is basically just a concrete pit where they dumped all the radioactive material, which resulted from the testing, and also from other parts as well, and they just put it into a big concrete pit, covered the pit up with concrete, and they knew that it was only going to be safe for 20 years, but then they left that for another generation, and that pit is predictably leaking radioactivity as well. So those kinds of stories and those kinds of messages, which are delivered by the communities that are most affected by them, are certainly a very important way of keeping the issue, driving the issue forward in the multilateral sphere. But I think it's also really important to remember that that's how we can break through. I mean, the UN can be a little bit of a bubble, or the multilateral sphere, as I call it in kind of general terms, can be a bit of a bubble, and we need to try to break through. We need to change people's minds, outside in the public sphere as well. So those messages we find to be the most effective in that way.
And I think that speaks as well to the short-sightedness in how we think about security, that our time horizons of threats and the impact of threats and the impact of solutions is so short. And this kind of dialogue reveals that we've got to be thinking in far longer terms about what do these weapons mean? What do they mean for the future environment, for the future people who might be affected? Another thing I thought that I think is really powerful about ICAN is how you do work with so many member organizations. You spoke about working with 108 organizations worldwide. How do you go about doing that? How do you maintain those relations? Is that gathered over the course of the campaign? Are you always actively seeking more members to work with?
Yeah, we definitely are. So it's 108 countries, and we have over 600 partner organizations. And we are always, we have a very straightforward application process for it. I mean, obviously, we review it to make sure that the organization is actually focused on nuclear weapons and will, work on the TPNW. But there's no membership fees or anything like that. So it's kind of very much, partners that are self-motivated to work on this as well. Basically, the coordination involves just a lot of emails back and forth. It's a lot of conversations. It's a lot of phone calls. Back in the day when I started, it was Skype, and now, of course, it's Zoom and Slack and other kind of platforms like that as well. So that's a big part of our work at the kind of the headquarters, if you want to call it that, in Geneva, is to. Our staff we have 14 people on staff. now. So the main part of our job is to kind of coordinate with partners in other countries, either to give them information about what we've heard from their government or other governments here, or vice versa, to hear what they've said, and then we can kind of use that as much as possible as well. But I mean, where the treaty is more of a political issue, of course, that work, there's not much that diplomats from a country like, the Netherlands can do or are willing to do here in Geneva. That work is a political work that involves, everything from getting people out on the streets, or more direct, lobbying work at the parliament, or getting cities to sign up for this ICAN cities appeal, or or even a lot of partners just focus on purely do research as well. So the ICAN partnership base is lots of different kinds of organizations. It's not just like pure advocacy, lobby, disarmament organizations. Greenpeace, for example, is a member of ICAN as well. So they bring in their area of work as well. So we have organizations that size, but then we also have organizations that are just one or two people working in their country doing research as well. So it's kind of the whole breadth of things, but certainly it's a big part of everyone's job on the team to coordinate with the partnership base. And I think one other reason it's able to be so, even with so many organizations, be kind of feel like a proactive and a nice community as well, is because we have had these moments over the years. I often joke with some of my colleagues that I feel really, really close to, and I feel like they're really close friends. And I actually think about, we've only actually met in person, 8 times, but it's because when we meet those times, those are quite intense work periods. I mean, these conferences I referred to before, or meeting at the UN, or the negotiations, certainly. I mean, these are kind of really, bonding experiences that also motivates people to keep working on this, on an issue which is frankly just extremely, requires a lot of endurance to work on it, because 99% of the time from your government you'll get a no, or either we don't have time, or this isn't an issue for us, or what are you talking about, nuclear weapons are super important, or more kind of nefarious things like you're working for the enemy, or you're making North Korea happy, those kinds of things.
Yeah, I was curious about that, because I know that during the course of the campaign, you have received some objections and some critique. How have you handled some of the critique you've faced, and also what have been the main challenges over the course, both of that initial period before 2017, but since? What have been some of those big hurdles you've had to work to overcome, or are still working to overcome?
Yeah. I'll take that. Maybe I'll just answer on the critiques first. I mean, there are obviously answering the critiques is itself a challenge as well. But I think the criticism that we get, I'd say maybe there's 3, but I'll add more if I think of them as I talk. The first area of criticism, which you get from, let's say, the nuclear weapon states themselves, really the hardcore, the believers in nuclear weapons, is that nuclear weapons are super important. They keep the peace. They are, I mean, France talks about them in terms of like their national prestige and their right to have these kinds of weapons. Those arguments are actually the most, they're the most difficult to, you can't convince the other side of that. There's no, they want to have their weapons, certain people in these countries. So there's no real point in kind of trying to convince them. You talk to, you try to change the political situation in that country. That's what you're trying to do. The second area of criticism is probably is more about the technicalities of the treaty as well, which is also quite easy to deal with, because there's a lot of, as active as we've been to promote the treaty, there has been an equally active, opposition, which comes from the capitals of these countries, and of course the NATO headquarters at the moment is, and I should differentiate between NATO headquarters and the NATO member states, because there's varying positions among the NATO member states, but between Washington DC and Brussels NATO headquarters, there's a lot of misinformation that comes out about the treaty in terms of how it would work. So things about, I can get technical if we want, but I'm not sure if we want to do that. But things about how the safeguard provisions works, the the additional protocol to the IAEA, these kinds of things, why they're in the treaty or why they're not in the treaty as well. And those things we can kind of easily dismiss as well. The most difficult part, and I think this is also the biggest challenge for us, is the question of why is this important? Why is this relevant for us to do about this? Why is it relevant for me as a citizen? Why is it relevant for this government? We have got lots of issues, lots of pressing issues to work on. Why do we need to do more than just deliver a statement, at the UN? And I think that's quite a challenge, because obviously we understand that, for every government, there's a multitude of issues to work on, issues that have, for them, what they perceive as more kind of daily pressing issues as well. And to talk about something that they have been, fed is not an issue for them. That's quite challenging as well. So, I mean, those are kind of the main areas of criticism, I suppose. In terms of the challenges that we faced, the first one, which is always a challenge for, I'm sure there's lots of people from civil society organizations on this call as well, so that probably relate to this very well, is funding. It's very, very difficult to get funding for disarmament work in general, and especially disarmament advocacy work. I would say it's very easy. I don't know. I shouldn't say it's easy, because I know you've worked in the academic sphere as well. But it seems to us, and what we understand, is that it's very easy to do research about non-proliferation and kind of arms control from a kind of an academic neutral standpoint as well. I know it's never easy, but a lot more money goes towards that and to issues that talk more about non-proliferation than it does to kind of advocacy, trying to change the policies of governments as well. And that's because the main sources of funding for civil society in general generally come from the countries that are most complicit with nuclear weapons as well. So, and I don't just mean the governments themselves. I mean the kind of the institutions around governments, the kind of the establishment. Yeah, I didn't want to say it, but I'm happy you did. Yes, the complex there. So that's a big issue, is the funding issue, and that will always be an issue as well. Of course, media is a massive issue as well. A lot of the kind of media, the way that the media talks about the issue has been massively informed by some of the kind of the leading think tanks who are very closely associated with the governments in many cases around this issue. So that's why you hear terms like, a country can talk about their deterrent, and the reporter will never ask, well, don't you mean the nuclear weapon that, can cause, mass murder and devastate the environment as well? And you'll never hear a question, very rarely will you hear a question about, well, what's the plan for dealing with the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons if you say that we're ready to use nuclear weapons as well? So there's this kind of whole narrative around nuclear weapons as well, this whole mythology and this whole language around it, which is quite difficult as well. And I think that is the kind of also the next challenge that I talk about, is just the kind of almost this indoctrination that certainly I think maybe I can only speak to having grown up in a kind of a Western country, this mythology that nuclear weapons are weapons that kept us safe. They're the reason that there hasn't been major power war since 1945 as well. And that, breaking down those myths and helping people understand why it's not necessarily true, and the evidence points against the fact that the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki ended World War II. There has been a lot of conflict since 1945, even if it hasn't involved the kind of so-called major powers as well. So in what way do we think that nuclear weapons keep us safe? So that involves a lot of kind of explaining, which is quite difficult to do, because the way we consume information right now as people is obviously has to be very, very quick and sharp as well. So yeah, those are the I'd say those are the kind of the biggest challenges that we face.
No, that's brilliant. And it speaks as well to how we study them in school. The history of them is very much I speak from a British perspective, very much they kept us safe. They ended the war. They were ultimately a source of peace in a very counterintuitive logic. And so breaking that down becomes incredibly difficult. I was really struck reading the Nobel Prize acceptance speech of Beatrice Fien, where she spoke about how your campaign is rooted in rationality. And I'm a researcher and author on empathy and compassion, and I constantly encounter this difficulty of people saying that's really idealistic. It's not very rational, and emotions they don't have a place within this space. And this idea that you can imagine something better and you can see the best of people is seen as a little bit naive. And I wonder if that's something that you also face quite a lot of, and how you push back against that impression.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, the whole question of being naive is something that you get both in, whether it be responses to our TikTok videos as well, or discussions with, with diplomats at the UN, or with politicians as well. It's either you're being naive, or you're making, in a lot of Western countries right now, it's, you're doing a favor to the Russians, who don't have democracy or civil society as well. And yeah, I mean, the kind of the way that you, I mean, it's extremely difficult to challenge that, especially in the comment section of a TikTok video. On something else, you can't target that individual and be like, where did you learn this logic, because you might might need to rethink it. That's not going to happen constructively in that context. But I think, like, it is, as you say, and I think that's what we definitely, and Beatrice definitely tried to do with her Nobel Peace Prize speech as well, was to say, we have to reframe it as, like, by focusing on the actual facts around nuclear weapons, what we know about what they do, and what we know in terms of the risks, how, and I think Chatham House has done a lot of studies on risk as well, and how we misunderstand risk around nuclear weapons, and we, mix it up with probability as well. And I think that these are super important things to kind of change the way that people feel it. Not that we're trying to, I mean, we don't want to instill fear in people as well, because what we know is that is very demotivating, and it's not a very good, advocacy stance. I mean, you have to be serious about the consequences and the problem at hand, and you have to be very, sober about it. But you also have to give something for people to kind of be motivated around. And I think a lot of people do get motivated around the kind of, that kind of click of, like, actually, this is crazy. This is stupid. Like, why are we working? Like, why are we doing it this way? And this whole idea that nuclear weapons policy, and I'd be interested to know if this was the same in the kind of the climate space, a few years ago as well, like, that this is a area that's just for the experts. This is only the experts. You have to have a PhD on this topic, or you have to be a government diplomat to really understand, or you have to be in the military to really understand what these weapons mean. And I think that's not really a standard that we have in other areas, like in the human rights field. It's like, is this a correct act? Is this right to do or wrong to do as well? Are nuclear weapons good or bad? And I think it is as simple as that. And obviously we want to make it as simple as that, because nuclear weapons are not just going to stay in the ground forever. They will be used, one day if we don't act on it as well. So I think, that, and kind of varying degrees of that, obviously varying levels of nuance to that, depending on the audience that we're speaking to, is the kind of the way that we tackle it as well. But I definitely think that, you're speaking about kind of empathy and the kind of the importance of that. That's what we really try to do in all our messaging as well, is kind of remind people that this is a human issue. This is a human, there's human impact here. This is not just like a policy thing that happens in some kind of back room at the Pentagon. This is something that will affect everyone.
Yeah, I always try and make the point that it's really pragmatic. It's not really rational or naive. It's really pragmatic. If you want to secure the future, you have to take people with you. You have to think about the long-term implications of your actions and your choices. And you have to really start thinking not in material terms and profit terms, but about what is going to help people thrive, what is going to help them live in a safe and secure world. And that means talking to people who are excluded. So it's, I thought it was really striking reading the speech. Yeah. I'm really curious. It's a question that's come up, actually, and I want to bring it up now because I think it's a really good one. How do you find the courage and the motivation to work on this? How did you get into this space, and how do you keep going? It's a question from Jeffrey, I believe, which I think I want to pose to you now.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think, first of all, how I got into this was kind of by chance as well. I mean, I was, long story short, I was studying law in Edinburgh in Scotland, and realized that I didn't want to go into private practice. I was kind of more interested in international law. And so I was, I kind of started applying for internships in Geneva, and I kind of, was interested in the humanitarian field as well. And I wasn't thinking at all about nuclear weapons as well. I mean, I kind of probably came into ICAN with a lot of the same kinds of, ideas, as many people have. But I think once I, and I think, I'm sure everyone on this call is much more enlightened than I was before I joined the campaign. But when I got in, what really kind of motivated me, and what still motivates me today, is the kind of just the hypocrisy of it, and the kind of first of all, the arrogance in the face of people who've suffered a lot and who know what nuclear weapons mean. And there's some governments, and there's some, people, there's some think tanks that just they intentionally, dismiss them. We had one academic who talked about that the idea of banning nuclear weapons was immoral as well. I mean, this was a paper that came out a long time ago. And then these kinds of things, they've become very kind of motivating, because you just feel the kind of the hypocrisy, and you feel the kind of the arrogance, and it makes you really, want to push for it. And also, I think what is super important, and another thing that we tell ourselves a lot, is to focus on the small victories. We're trying to ban nuclear weapons. I mean, just saying that out loud sounds like, yeah, it's a massive deal. It's like,
no,
it's like on par with yeah, we need to end, we need to stop using fossil fuels. It's like, whoa. But you have to really focus on the kind of the small victories as well. So, obviously back in the day, we were focusing on, we got this country to say humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons in their statement. And then a few years later, we got them to talk about the idea of a prohibition. We explained to them what the prohibition was. We got them to support the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons as well. So it's focusing on the kind of the piecemeal steps. And I think for people who are working in the most difficult political context on this, that is the most kind of, that's what they, they need. Otherwise it's, you just kind of, in Swedish, you say you're punching the air kind of thing, and that's really kind of super important. So focusing on the small victories, and kind of having the sense of togetherness, and as well, and a bit of compassion, and feeling part of a team as well, which we do very much in the staff here in Geneva, but also I think with a broader campaign as well. Did that answer your question, or did I go off on a tangent?
It did. Okay. Yeah, I think, and there must be so much energy that comes with the momentum. Like you say, it's small wins, but if you can feel, and I know from working with people in campaigns, that you get a feel that, okay, there is a change. It's going to maybe take a few years, maybe a decade, but the tide starts turning. You can feel people talking about things differently. There's an energy that comes with it. So what's next?
I mean, we're super impatient as well. I mean, that's the kind of thing. It's like we feel like we get frustrated when we can't get we can't. I mean, I obviously, being from Sweden, I get super frustrated when I see Sweden moving farther away from the treaty, as well. And I remember in 2015, before the treaty, we're like, it's not moving fast enough, And then we look back now, and it's like, oh, how did we get a treaty in 7 years? But from when the first person said humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons to negotiating a treaty, and that's it's no time at all, really.
Yeah. So what's next what's the next milestone? Because obviously, like you say, countries like Sweden, there's still a lot of countries that haven't signed or ratified. What is the next step to achieve this kind of goal at a more global level?
Yeah. I mean, the immediate next step, and I think this is another issue that's super important for us to remember, is that, and I think it's the same in a lot of spheres. You focus on the states that annoy you the most, right, or the ones that are the most, opposed to the issue, the most kind of difficult. But we have to remember that the vast majority of the world has nothing to do with nuclear weapons, wants nothing to do with nuclear weapons, and support the treaty as well. And I think obviously a big part of that is translating that into countries actually signing and ratifying the treaty, which takes, it's not as well. Maybe many of you have experience with this, but it's quite a lot of work. It's, in terms of shepherding it through the different procedures in each government as well. So that's always going to be a huge priority on us. Is focusing on the governments that that are champions for this issue and can be even more vocal champions for the issue as well. So getting them to sign the treaty, getting them to participate at the meeting of states parties, which is another huge priority. So like most treaties, there are conferences where states parties meet and discuss the status of the treaty and discuss any issues that need to be addressed. And we had the first meeting of states parties for the TPNW last year. And the next one is taking place in 2 months, almost a little bit less than 2 months from now in New York as well. So the last one is in Vienna, sorry, but this one's going to be in New York. And so that is a huge opportunity to get as many governments as possible to kind of attend and speak out and really engage in the kind of the material of the treaty. I mean, people talk about the TPNW being symbolic, perhaps, because none of the nuclear weapon states are on board, but a lot of the kind of the possible future architecture for nuclear disarmament, verification, disarmament can and is starting to take place within the context of the TPNW, either through the intersessional periods, the meetings between the meeting of states parties, but also at the meeting of states parties themselves as well. But of course, the elephant in the room, what are we doing with the states that oppose the treaty as well? And it's, it is focusing on, different aspects. Obviously, the call for signing the TPNW is the same for every country. We can't have different calls. We can't say, oh, US, we know you're Russia, we know that you are too far away from this. We're only asking you to do this. We have the same call for every country as well. It might mean that in certain countries we focus more on the kind of the victim assistance aspect as well. So we try to, support and build up the work of communities in affected states to, raise awareness about what has actually happened and what hasn't taken place in terms of remediation as well. Actually, in French Polynesia, there's a motion going through the French Polynesian Regional Parliament right now, which is calling on the government to join the treaty. And that's from France, one of the most rabidly opposed countries as well. And obviously French Polynesia was massively and still has many affected individuals from the French testing as well. So making it as difficult as possible, A, for governments to ignore the treaty, and B, for them not to engage with it as well. So we try to find, like I said before, those kind of small wins in these countries as well. And one of them that we're focusing on right now is of course to get these governments to engage as observers at the treaty MSP, the meeting of states parties as well, to at least share their views about the treaty. Obviously, that's not a replacement for signing in our minds, but at least to share their views and to share their kind of expertise as well. And that work is done. Getting them to do that involves engaging with parliamentarians, passing motions in parliaments to either mandate or encourage the government to join as well, and also raising awareness with the public in whatever way that that can take place. I mean, that involves a lot of social media work, a lot of kind of local organizing, but for that we really kind of depend on the partners as well.
Yeah, it's a lot of work, but I hope it goes really well. I'm wondering about a question that someone's put in the comments, which I think is really important as well. What do you recommend for individuals who care about this issue, but maybe feel like they don't know enough, they don't know where to start finding out more, and what actions maybe can they take?
So I think to people who feel like they don't know enough about the topic, I think is to really be kind of fearless about it, because like I said before, you don't really need to know about how nuclear fission and nuclear fusion takes place, right? You need to know what the impacts of the weapon are, what they do to people. Is it possible to kind of control them as well. And so obviously we have a lot of material on the ICAN website, just kind of, basic primer material about, why nuclear weapons need to be abolished as well. We can do, from Geneva side, we can contact a parliamentarian in, I've said the Netherlands a lot, but let's say Singapore, for example. We can contact a parliamentarian in Singapore to say, please join this treaty. But of course, if it's someone in Singapore who contacts their own parliamentarian, that's much more effective. That's like 10 times as effective as an email coming from a campaign organization, across the world as well. So we're always looking for people to engage and write to their governments, write to their parliamentarians. We have something called the ICAN Cities Appeal, which I'd say half of the cases have come from, not from ICAN partner organizations doing the work, or maybe, loosely affiliated with partners, but from individuals who contact their, local, mayor, or if it's a big city, perhaps a council person, to pass a motion in support of the ICAN Cities Appeal, which basically is just a motion that has, where the city, Nairobi calls on its government to sign and ratify the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, for example. So that's something that public people in the public have done and have taken the lead on as well. I think it depends. Also, what I usually say in response to this question as well is that whatever your kind of perspective is and whatever you kind of work on, I mean, you don't have to be you don't have to be a campaigner on nuclear disarmament to work on this. Whatever your issue is, there is definitely a link to nuclear weapons as well. There's this really great old photograph from a protest in Sweden against nuclear weapons in I think it was in the 80s as well. And there was this big sign, and it was people carrying it, and it said hairdressers against nuclear weapons. And I thought that was just like absolutely brilliant. I mean, like, of course, like, and I think that's like super effective as well. It's like, we are, this might not be an issue that you think is relevant for this group of people, but of course it is. Like, of course that voice that matters a lot as well. And I think whatever you work on, there's an angle to bring into the nuclear weapons things. And if it's hard to think of it, we can help. We can help you.
Especially though, with this humanitarian impact, it's such a useful lens because it can be so inclusive in that way. So if you've got medics, if you've got farmers, if you've got people who are in schools and education, it's all about thinking, how would you cope in this area of your expertise if there was a nuclear attack? What would it take to rebuild? What would it take to provide the services that you do? It's a real useful entryway to people to think about what it would look like. Because it's true, as you said earlier on, we often remove nuclear weapons from the everyday. It's done by a certain sector of the population, of the political arena and industry and academics, but actually thinking through how we would cope is quite a useful way to start.
No, exactly. Every government should at least be able to answer the question, like, what's the plan if a nuclear weapon goes off, right? You haven't thought about this at all, but you support the weapon itself. Why is that?
It's not enough to just have a bunker and go walking through an apocalypse with a trolley.
Yeah. I mean, Switzerland is in this country, we have a report on this as well about the kind of the bunkers and this kind of myth that bunkers will keep us safe. Actually, every building in Switzerland, including the one I'm in right now, has a bunker. I mean, usually people use it for storage, right? But there's this is just a myth to make us feel better about the topic as well. Bunkers aren't going to keep us safe.
I believe that ICAN was a bit critical of the Oppenheimer film, but I'm wondering whether you found that the prominence of the topic through this kind of Hollywood blockbuster has actually helped people seek out your campaign, seek out more information a bit more, or has it actually been detrimental because it's once again focused the attention on maybe the wrong aspect of the debate?
Yeah, I go back and forth about this. It's a really good question. I mean, we knew that obviously we had to do some work on it as well. It's a big blockbuster movie, about nuclear weapons. So we knew that we were going to work on it. I mean, I think the movie itself is, it misses a lot, right? It misses a lot about there's no depiction of, the aftermath of the bombing in Hiroshima. Not a single scene as a reference, and obviously Cillian Murphy looks very kind of troubled by it, and very tortured genius kind of thing. And of course that's but then what are we expecting really? This is a movie about Cillian Murphy, and like we were thinking like, okay, do we need to have some demands of of the studio when they do this as well? Ultimately, I think the problem with it is that it kind of confirms whatever you do believe one way or the other. So I don't think we found it to be kind of a breakthrough moment in the same way that people who were of age in the 80s might remember movies like Threads and The Day After, right, which kind of really led to an awakening about like what these weapons are massively scary, right, and they kind of really did feed into the political consciousness of the times. And I think the reason is that those movies really focused on the terror of nuclear war at a time when people were kind of very kind of aware of it. And I think the problem is that we are very kind of aware of the problem right now. I mean, there's a war going on in Ukraine. There's threats to use nuclear weapons that are taking place all the time, mainly from Russia as well. But I still think that there's kind of this Cold War era thinking around nuclear weapons that I think from a good standpoint, like I think the younger generations are not not burdened by that thinking. I think there's a lot of kind of opportunity. We certainly see that a lot on kind of social media and TikTok and Instagram as well, is that the reactions to it are like WTF, like this is crazy, rather than the trolling kind of like this is so naive. So I don't think that, coming back to the Oppenheimer film, I don't think it was a make or break one way or another. It was kind of a flash moment, but I don't know, that's my opinion, and my colleagues might have a different view of that. We did a lot of work on it, so maybe I shouldn't say that it was so.
I mean it's great to hear though that you're finding younger generations are becoming more vocal. I think we're seeing that across security, climate change, human rights, nuclear weapons. There is this real hopeful movement of we can do things better, we can change things, this is not inevitable. And certainly social media in that way does help people connect with these issues, especially, like you say, using social media as a way to communicate the impact. You reach such a wider, younger audience in a way that maybe traditionally they wouldn't have had access to these debates. So I feel hopeful for the future. I am probably misplaced in that optimism. But I don't know, how do you?
I don't think so. I think like speaking to the nuclear weapons issue as well, and looking at past kind of issues, the turning point happens super quickly. I mean, you feel when you're on the wrong side of that turning point, it's just like, how is this ever going to happen as well? But I think with the issue of nuclear weapons, I think it'll be when the turning point happens, and in future generations, we'll look back and be like, how on earth did they keep the means to destroy the earth around for so long, and just hope that 9 individuals wouldn't take the decision, wouldn't misunderstand each other or something, especially given all the information we know right now about accidents and all we will learn in the future that we don't have access to yet. I think it'll be like a really like, I can't believe it took that long as well. And I certainly, speaking to others who work on other issues, I think that's a similar experience that they felt as well.
It kind of doesn't move until suddenly it does, and then suddenly you're dealing with a very different reality and you have to adapt very quickly. We've got a few minutes left, and we had another question in the comments from Zabine about is there much of a global focus within your organization, or perhaps more within some of the partner organizations, on funding education for peace? Yeah,
definitely. We have a lot of partner organizations who have this as their kind of primary area of focus as well. And I should say the UN itself does a lot of disarmament education work as well. So they should get credit for that as well. We have partner organizations that who don't do any kind of political advocacy work. What they do is they go to schools and educate primary school children, secondary school children, high school high schoolers about nuclear weapons as well, and obviously with the appropriate level of sensitivity given the age as well. But I think that's super kind of important work as well. We have a big focus now on universities. I mean, also including like the way that nuclear weapons, some universities, especially in nuclear weapon states, they're complicit in the system. They teach certain courses, and they also send graduate students to work at nuclear weapons factories. So obviously there's that element of it, but also in terms of what courses are taught, at these universities about nuclear weapons as well. So we kind of try to work with the academic community on kind of generating more awareness about this is a progressive way about talking about nuclear weapons at the kind of university level as well. So I think that's a really good question, and certainly it's a big part of our work. And if we don't think that this issue is going to be solved in the next 20 years, obviously it's in our interest as an advocacy organization to make sure that more minds are open to this going forward as well.
Yeah, I saw as well today that North Korea has just signed in their constitution new initiatives, just amend its constitution to strengthen its nuclear powers. So it's not an issue that's going to go away, especially when we look at the international politics. And how do you, final question, how do you navigate those international politics, especially in the current environment where we are seeing this return to kind of sizable powers standing off against each other, increasing conflict in certain areas? How do you navigate that? How do you change maybe your campaigns to speak to some of those?
Yeah, I mean, without, I don't mean this in like kind of a negative way, but we do have to be opportunistic, right? There's not many opportunities for a campaign or a civil society organization like ours to insert ourselves into a kind of the public discourse about the issue as well. So, for example, when Trump was elected president of the United States as well, I mean, there was a lot of focus about, well, do we really trust, in the United States about can he be trusted with the nuclear weapons program as well? And of course, that's something that's useful for us to talk about. Like this is terrifying, but also should any individual be trusted with the nuclear weapons issue? Can we trust anyone? Like, do we trust, if we think that, was the world much safer before Trump when Putin was in control of nuclear weapons as well? So we do try to like kind of jump on certain issues like that. I mean, obviously we have the arguments that we have, and some of them play better at certain times as well. I mean, in the current climate as well, when there is a kind of real increase in militarism and kind of support for weapons transfers, supports for arms exports, supports for more funding for defense, for militaries and armies. Like, we have to be more conscious of the fact that we need to differentiate. I mean, it's difficult for some of our partners who work on all weapons issues, but for us as a campaign, we have to focus on the nuclear weapons issue. We have to differentiate between, still support the broader community of the peace movement, of which we're a part, of course, but talk about specifically how nuclear weapons have nothing, they have no place in this conflict. Having nuclear weapons around in the world makes this conflict more dangerous. Having nuclear weapons was one of the reasons why, the fact that nuclear weapons still exist is one of the reasons why Russia could feel so bold and confident about invading another country. And that's not to say that Ukraine should have had nuclear weapons as well to defend itself. That's another spurious argument that we hear as well. But that, there's this kind of nuclear blackmail term which is thrown around as well. So yeah, it is kind of like adjusting the messaging to the situation as well. And then that's a constant challenge. And I think what we want to do, and I think where the climate movement, obviously I know it's a huge issue there as well from speaking with counterparts there, but they are ahead of the issue. They're ahead of the news cycle in a way that we need to also be with the nuclear weapons. We're very much in reacting mode to what has North Korea done now? What has Putin said now about nuclear weapons? What's going on with the Iran deal? And we need to try to be better at kind of setting the agenda when it comes to the media. Well, not just the media. I think it's wrong to just focus on the the media aspect of it, but the public discourse, the public attention around this.
Oh, I have so enjoyed speaking with you. Thank you so much.
Likewise.
It's such a privilege, and your advocacy is really inspiring. Thank you so much for taking the time. I always think it's a cliche, but this idea of in every crisis there is an opportunity is so true. And especially when we face what looks like such dark times ahead, looking for the light, looking for people who are saying we can do better is such an important way to view the world. Otherwise, it's just far too negative and far too miserable. So thank you for all you're doing. And thank you as well for taking the time to speak with us and share your experiences and your insights.
Well, thank you so much for having me as well. And thank you a lot to the Global Compassion Coalition. I think it's really amazing work that you do, and it's an honor to be here.
This podcast was brought to you by the Global Compassion Coalition. To access more content like this, as well as resources integrating compassion into your daily routine, make sure to subscribe to this podcast and visit our website at globalcompassioncoalition.org.